Groundskeeper vanished in 1994. 20 years later, his watch is found clutched in a burial vault. The morning mist clung to the weathered headstones of Millbrook Cemetery like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the sacred ground. October in Vermont had always been Thomas Brennan's favorite time of year, when the maple trees blazed crimson and gold against the steel-gray sky, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter's approach. 20 years ago, his father, Patrick Brennan, had vanished without a trace from this very cemetery, leaving behind only questions and a family shattered by uncertainty. The 53-year-old groundskeeper had simply disappeared during his evening rounds on October 15, 1994. His tools left scattered near the old mausoleum, his truck still running in the parking lot. But now, as Thomas knelt beside the cracked foundation of the Morrison family vault, staring at the tarnished gold watch clutched in the skeletal fingers of what appeared to be a recently disturbed grave, everything he thought he knew about his father's disappearance began to crumble. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The watch was unmistakable, a 1970 Timex with a distinctive scratch across the face, the same watch his father had worn every day for over 2 decades. Thomas had bought it for him as a Father's Day gift when he was just 16, saving up 3 months of lawn mowing money to afford it. The vault had been scheduled for routine maintenance, part of the cemetery's modernization project that Thomas now oversaw as head groundskeeper. When the construction crew had removed the heavy stone slab, they'd expected to find the usual deterioration, maybe some water damage, perhaps a few scattered bones that had shifted over the decades. Instead, they discovered something that made even the most hardened workers step back in shock. The skeleton wasn't alone. Clutched in its left hand was the watch, its gold-plated band still wrapped around the wrist bones, and beside it lay a small pile of personal effects that clearly didn't belong to the Morrison family members who had been laid to rest here in 1923. Thomas's hands trembled as he reached for his cell phone, the weight of 20 years of unanswered questions pressing down on him like the Vermont winter that was fast approaching. He had been 32 when his father disappeared, married with 2 young children, working as a carpenter in nearby Rutland. The disappearance had torn through their small community like a wildfire, leaving suspicion and fear in its wake. The police had investigated, of course. Sheriff Bradley Henderson had interviewed everyone who knew Patrick, followed every lead, checked every abandoned building within a 50-mile radius. But Patrick Brennan had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind a wife, 3 children, and a mystery that had haunted Millbrook for 2 decades. "Tom, you still down there?" The voice of Jake Morrison, the construction foreman, echoed down into the vault. "Everything okay?" Thomas looked up at the rectangle of grey sky visible through the vault's opening, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd found. Jake Morrison was the great-grandson of the family buried here, a respected local contractor who had volunteered his services for the cemetery restoration project. He was also someone Thomas had known since childhood, someone who had been one of the last people to see Patrick alive. "Yeah, I'm coming up," Thomas called back, his voice hoarse with emotion. He took one last look at the watch, its face reflecting the dim light filtering down from above. The hands had stopped at 11:47, though whether that was AM or PM, Thomas couldn't tell. What he did know was that his father's evening rounds typically ended around midnight, and Patrick had been obsessively punctual his entire life. Thomas climbed the metal ladder that Jake's crew had installed, his knees weak with the weight of discovery. When he emerged from the vault, he found Jake standing nearby, his weathered face creased with concern. "Find something interesting down there?" Jake asked, lighting a cigarette with hands that seemed steadier than Thomas's own. "You could say that," Thomas replied, pulling out his phone. "I need to call Sheriff Henderson." Jake's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something that might have been concern or fear crossing his features. "Sheriff Henderson? Why would you need to call him about some old bones?" Thomas studied his childhood friend's face, noting the way Jake's eyes avoided direct contact, the nervous way he drew on his cigarette. "Because I think I just found my father." The words hung in the cold air between them like a physical presence. Jake's cigarette paused halfway to his lips, and Thomas could see the man's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. "Your father? Tom, that's impossible. These bones have been here for decades, maybe longer. Sometimes old graves get disturbed and—" "He's wearing my father's watch, Jake." Thomas's voice was steady now, the initial shock giving way to a cold certainty. The watch I gave him for Father's Day in 1978, the one he never took off. Jake dropped his cigarette, grinding it under his heel with more force than necessary. Jesus, Tom, are you sure? I mean, watches can look similar, and after all these years, I'm sure. Thomas was already dialing, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the phone's keypad. I'm very sure. As the phone rang, Thomas watched Jake's face carefully. The man was clearly agitated, his hands shaking slightly as he lit another cigarette. There was something in his expression, a knowledge, perhaps, or a fear that went deeper than simple concern for a friend's shocking discovery. Sheriff Henderson's office, came the professional voice of Deputy Sarah Walsh. Deputy Walsh, this is Thomas Brennan. I need to speak with Sheriff Henderson immediately. It's about my father's disappearance. There was a pause, and Thomas could hear the shuffling of papers in the background. Everyone in Millbrook knew about Patrick Brennan's disappearance. It had been the biggest mystery in their small town's history. I'll get him for you right away, Mr. Brennan. As Thomas waited for the sheriff to come on the line, he noticed that Jake had moved closer to the vault's opening, peering down into the darkness with an intensity that seemed almost desperate. The man's entire demeanor had changed in the space of a few minutes, from casual concern to something that looked remarkably like panic. Thomas, what's this about your father? Sheriff Henderson's voice was cautious but alert. Brad Henderson had been a deputy 20 years ago when Patrick disappeared, and he'd taken over as sheriff when his predecessor retired in 2005. The case had always bothered him, Thomas knew, one of those unsolved mysteries that kept law enforcement officers awake at night. I found him, Sheriff. I found my father's body. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. Finally, Henderson spoke. Where are you, Thomas? Millbrook Cemetery, the Morrison Vault. We were doing restoration work, and... Thomas glanced at Jake, who was still staring down into the vault. Sheriff, I think this might be a crime scene. Don't touch anything else. Don't let anyone else down there. I'm on my way. As Thomas ended the call, he noticed that Jake had backed away from the vault, his face pale in the grey morning light. The man was scanning the cemetery grounds as if looking for something, or someone. Jake, Thomas said quietly, is there anything you want to tell me about this? Jake's eyes snapped back to Thomas, and for a moment something raw and frightened flickered across his features. What do you mean? I mean, you seem pretty shaken up for someone who just found some old bones. Jake forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow in the morning air. Of course I'm shaken up. Finding out your friend's father has been buried in my family's vault for 20 years? That's not exactly an everyday occurrence. Thomas nodded slowly, but he didn't look away from Jake's face. There was something there, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. 20 years of wondering, of sleepless nights and unanswered questions, had given Thomas a keen sense for detecting lies. How do you think he got in there, Jake? How would I know? Maybe someone was using the vault to hide the body. Maybe whoever killed him figured no one would look in a sealed grave. The words came out too quickly, too rehearsed, as if Jake had been thinking about this exact scenario for years. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. But the vault was sealed, Jake. The stone slab weighed over 1,000 pounds. It would have taken equipment to move it. Jake's cigarette had burned down to his fingers, but he didn't seem to notice. Equipment like what my construction company has, you mean? There it was. The admission Thomas hadn't expected to hear so soon. Jake Morrison, his childhood friend, the man who had comforted his mother at the funeral they'd never been able to hold, was telling him that he had the means to move that stone. Yeah, Thomas said quietly. Equipment like that. The sheriff's cruiser pulled into the cemetery's gravel parking lot with a spray of loose stones, followed closely by the county coroner's van and a crime scene unit from the state police. Thomas watched from his position near the vault as Sheriff Henderson stepped out of his vehicle, his grey hair more abundant than it had been 20 years ago, but his steel-blue eyes just as sharp. Jake Morrison stood nearby, chain-smoking and pacing in small circles. He'd grown increasingly agitated as they waited, checking his phone repeatedly and glancing toward the cemetery's entrance as if expecting someone to arrive. Thomas, Sheriff Henderson said, extending his hand, I'm sorry it took so long to get here. I wanted to bring the full team. He gestured toward the crime scene technicians who were already unpacking their equipment. Dr. Sarah Chen from the state coroner's office and Detective Mike Rodriguez from the state police. Thomas shook hands with each of them, noting how their professional demeanor couldn't quite mask their curiosity. A 20-year-old missing person case suddenly becoming a homicide investigation was the kind of thing that made careers or ended them. "Can you walk me through exactly what happened this morning?" Henderson asked, pulling out a worn notebook. Thomas recounted the morning's events, from the routine vault maintenance to the discovery of the skeleton and the watch. As he spoke, he noticed that Jake had moved closer, listening intently to every word. "And you're certain it's your father's watch?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice gentle but probing. "Absolutely certain. It has a distinctive scratch across the face, right here." Thomas traced a diagonal line across his own wrist. He got it when he was working on the cemetery's fountain back in 1983. A piece of granite chipped off and hit the watch. He always said it gave the watch character. Detective Rodriguez made notes in his tablet. "Mr. Morrison, you're the contractor overseeing the restoration project?" Jake nodded, stubbing out his cigarette. "That's right. We've been working on the cemetery for about 3 months now. This is the first vault we've opened. And you've had access to heavy equipment during this time?" "Of course, we needed it for the foundation work." Jake's voice was defensive, almost aggressive. "Look, I don't know what you're implying, but I've been nothing but helpful here." Thomas watched the exchange with growing unease. The Jake Morrison he'd known as a child had been calm, thoughtful, never one to lose his temper. This nervous, aggressive version was someone Thomas barely recognized. "No implications, Mr. Morrison, just gathering information." Rodriguez's tone was professionally neutral. "I understand you knew Patrick Brennan?" Everyone in Millbrook knew Patrick. He'd been the groundskeeper here for over 15 years when he disappeared. "But you knew him personally?" Jake hesitated, and Thomas saw him glance quickly in his direction before answering. "Sure, we went to school together. Tom here and I have been friends since we were kids." "And you were one of the last people to see Patrick alive?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. He'd known that Jake had been interviewed by the police 20 years ago, but he'd never known the specifics of what Jake had told them. "I might have been," Jake said slowly. "I was doing some work in the cemetery that day, installing new drainage pipes. Patrick and I talked for a few minutes around dinner time." "What did you talk about?" Just normal stuff. The weather, the job, how his family was doing." Jake's voice was getting higher, more strained. "Look, I answered all these questions 20 years ago. It's all in the file." Sheriff Henderson looked up from his notebook. "Mr. Morrison, I hope you understand that with new evidence we need to revisit all aspects of the original investigation." "New evidence? You mean the body?" "The body, the watch, the location?" Henderson's eyes narrowed. "And the fact that someone with access to heavy equipment would have been needed to move that stone slab." Thomas watched Jake's face drain of color. The man was clearly struggling to maintain his composure, and Thomas felt a growing sense of dread about what they might discover. "Dr. Chen," Thomas said, "how long would you estimate the body has been in the vault?" The coroner was crouched beside the opening, examining the skeleton with a practiced eye. "Preliminary assessment suggests 20 years, give or take. The rate of decomposition is consistent with the timeline you've described, though I'll need to do a full examination to be certain. Could you tell if he was killed? I can see what appears to be trauma to the skull, but I can't make a definitive determination without proper equipment and examination." Dr. Chen stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "What I can tell you is that the body was placed in the vault intentionally. The positioning isn't consistent with someone who fell or was dropped." Detective Rodriguez looked up from his tablet. "Positioned how?" "Carefully. Arms crossed, personal effects placed beside the body. Almost respectful." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. The image of his father being carefully arranged in a stranger's grave was somehow more disturbing than the idea of his body being carelessly disposed of. "That's sick," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who would do something like that?" The question seemed to be directed at no one in particular, but Thomas noticed that Jake's eyes were focused on the vault opening, as if he were seeing something the rest of them couldn't. "Mr. Morrison," Sheriff Henderson said, "I'd like you to come to the station later today to give a formal statement. We'll need to go over your original interview from 1994 and get your account of this morning's events." Jake nodded stiffly. "Of course, whatever you need." As the crime scene team began their work, Thomas found himself studying his childhood friend with new eyes. Jake Morrison had been part of their tight-knit group growing up. He, Thomas, and 2 other boys who had spent countless summer days exploring the woods around Millbrook, building forts, and sharing dreams of escape from their small town. Jake had been the practical one, the one who always knew how to fix things, how to solve problems. He'd gone into construction right after high school, eventually taking over his father's company when the older man retired. He'd married his high school sweetheart, had 3 kids, coached Little League baseball, and served on the town council. By all accounts, he was exactly the kind of person who held communities like Millbrook together. But standing here in the cemetery, watching Jake chain smoke and pace, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there was something fundamentally wrong with the picture he'd always had of his friend. "Thomas?" Sheriff Henderson approached, lowering his voice. "I'd like to talk to you privately for a few minutes." They walked toward the sheriff's cruiser, leaving the crime scene team to their work. Thomas noticed that Jake watched them go, his expression unreadable. "I want you to know," Henderson said, "that your father's disappearance has never been closed. We've followed up on every lead, every tip, every possible sighting for 20 years. I know, Sheriff. I appreciate everything you've done. What I'm about to tell you might be difficult to hear, but I think you need to know." Henderson paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your father didn't just disappear that night. He was running away." Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "What do you mean?" "He'd been having an affair, Thomas, with a married woman in town. Her husband found out, and Patrick was supposed to meet her that night to discuss leaving town together." Henderson's voice was gentle but firm. "When he didn't show up, she waited until morning, then left town by herself." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. His father, the man he'd idolized, the steady, dependable presence in his life, had been planning to abandon his family. "Who?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. "I can't tell you that. She's dead now anyway. Car accident about 10 years ago." Henderson studied Thomas's face with concern. "I'm sorry, son. I know this changes things." Thomas stared across the cemetery grounds, trying to process this new information. His father had been planning to leave them. But instead of running away to start a new life, he'd ended up dead in a stranger's grave. "Sheriff, if my father was planning to leave town, why would someone kill him? That's what we need to find out." Henderson glanced back toward the vault, where Jake Morrison was still pacing. "But I can tell you this. Whoever killed your father knew him well enough to know about the affair, and cared enough to arrange his body with respect." The implication was clear, even if Henderson wasn't saying it directly. Patrick Brennan had been killed by someone who knew him, someone who had access to the cemetery, someone with the equipment needed to move a 1,000-pound stone slab, someone like Jake Morrison. The Millbrook Sheriff's Office occupied a modest brick building on Main Street, sandwiched between Hartley's hardware store and the town's only pharmacy. Thomas had been inside only a few times in his life, once as a teenager, when he'd been caught spray painting his initials on the water tower, and again 20 years ago when he'd given his statement about his father's disappearance. Now, as he sat in the small interview room waiting for Sheriff Henderson, he found himself studying the faded photographs on the walls. Pictures of former sheriffs, town celebrations, and community events that stretched back to the 1950s. In one photo from 1993, he could see his father standing with other town employees at the annual Labor Day picnic, his arm around Thomas's mother, both of them smiling at the camera. They'd looked happy. Whatever affair his father had been having, it apparently hadn't shown in public. "Sorry to keep you waiting," Sheriff Henderson said, entering the room with a thick file folder and a cup of coffee. "I wanted to review your father's case file before we talked." Thomas nodded, noticing how the sheriff's demeanor had shifted from the sympathetic friend he'd known growing up to the professional lawman he'd become. 20 years of unsolved mysteries had a way of changing people. "I need to ask you some questions about your father's behavior in the weeks before he disappeared," Henderson said, opening the file. "I know this is difficult, but with new evidence, we need to examine everything again." "I understand. Did you notice any changes in your father's routine in September or October of 1994? Thomas thought back to that autumn, trying to separate his actual memories from the countless times he'd relived those weeks in his mind. He'd been working longer hours, said the cemetery needed extra attention before winter set in. Did he seem stressed? Anxious about anything? Maybe a little, but Dad was always a worrier. He took his job seriously. Thomas paused, then added, "He'd been getting phone calls at home. Always stepped outside to take them." Henderson made a note. "Do you remember when these calls started? Late August, maybe early September. Mom asked him about it once, and he said it was work-related. Something about the cemetery board wanting to make changes. But you didn't believe him?" Thomas shrugged. "It wasn't like Dad to be secretive about work. He usually told us everything that was going on at the cemetery, but these calls, he'd take them in the yard or down in the basement, somewhere where we couldn't hear. Henderson flipped through several pages in the file. Your father had been having financial difficulties, is that correct? Some. Mom had been sick the previous winter, pneumonia that turned into bronchitis. The medical bills were pretty steep for a groundskeeper's salary. Did he mention anything about getting extra work? Ways to earn additional income? Not that I remember. Thomas frowned. Why? Because according to his bank records, your father deposited over $3,000 in cash during September 1994. 3 separate deposits of $1,000 each. Thomas felt his stomach drop. In 1994, $3,000 was significant money for their family, nearly 2 months of his father's salary. I don't understand. Where would he have gotten that kind of money? That's what we need to find out. Henderson leaned forward. Thomas, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Did your father ever mention Jake Morrison during those weeks before he disappeared? The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. Jake? No, not that I remember. I mean, they knew each other, but they weren't close friends or anything. But Jake was working in the cemetery that fall. Yeah, he was doing some kind of drainage project. His father's company had the contract. Thomas felt a growing sense of unease. Sheriff, what are you thinking? Henderson closed the file and sat back in his chair. I'm thinking that your father's disappearance might not have been as random as we originally believed. Before Thomas could respond, there was a knock on the door. Deputy Walsh entered, her expression grim. Sheriff, Mr. Morrison is here for his interview, but we might have a problem. What kind of problem? He showed up with a lawyer. Says he's not answering any questions without counsel present. Henderson and Thomas exchanged looks. In a small town like Millbrook, hiring a lawyer was tantamount to an admission of guilt, or at least an admission that you had something to hide. Put them in conference room B, Henderson said. I'll be there in a few minutes. After Deputy Walsh left, Henderson turned back to Thomas. I need you to go home and think about everything your father did or said in those weeks before he disappeared. Anything that seemed unusual, no matter how small. You think Jake killed my father. I think Jake Morrison knows more than he's told us. Henderson stood up, gathering his files. And I think your father's affair might have been more complicated than we originally understood. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? I mean that sometimes affairs aren't about love, Thomas. Sometimes they're about business. And sometimes people get killed to keep secrets. As Thomas left the sheriff's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that his entire understanding of his father's life and death was built on lies. The man he'd mourned for 20 years wasn't the man who had actually lived in their house, worked in their cemetery, and died in a stranger's grave. He drove home through the familiar streets of Millbrook, past the houses where he'd grown up playing with Jake Morrison and the other kids in their neighborhood. It was a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where secrets were rare and scandal was long remembered. But apparently, some secrets were worth killing for. Thomas pulled into his driveway and sat in his truck for several minutes, staring at the house where his father had lived and died a lie. Inside, his wife Susan would be preparing dinner, their teenage daughter Emma would be doing homework, and their son Michael would be practicing guitar in his room. It was the kind of normal family life his father had been planning to abandon 20 years ago. The kind of life that someone had killed to protect. As Thomas walked toward his front door, he noticed a familiar pickup truck parked across the street. Jake Morrison was sitting behind the wheel, watching him with an expression that was impossible to read. Their eyes met for a moment, and Thomas saw something in Jake's face that made his blood run cold. It wasn't guilt or fear or even anger. It was desperation. Jake started his truck and drove away, leaving Thomas standing in his driveway with the growing certainty that his father's killer had been part of his life for 20 years, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the day when Patrick Brennan's body would finally be discovered. That day had finally come. The Millbrook Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, its rooms filled with carefully preserved artifacts from the town's 150-year history. Thomas had never been inside before, but after 3 sleepless nights following his father's discovery, he'd decided he needed to understand more about the cemetery and the people who had access to it in 1994. Martha Kellerman, the Society's president, was a woman in her 70s with steel-grey hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd been the town librarian for 40 years before retiring and was rumored to know more about Millbrook's secrets than anyone else alive. Thomas Brennan, she said, looking up from a box of old photographs. I heard about your father. I'm so sorry, dear. Patrick was a good man. Thank you, Mrs. Kellerman. I was hoping you might be able to help me understand something about the cemetery's history. She gestured toward a chair beside her desk. Of course. What would you like to know? The Morrison Vault. Can you tell me about the family? Martha's expression grew thoughtful. The Morrisons were one of Millbrook's founding families. Came here in 1847, started the first lumber mill. The vault was built in 1923 after the influenza epidemic. Killed most of the family. She paused. Why do you ask? My father's body was found there. I'm trying to understand who might have had access to it. Martha's eyes widened. In the Morrison Vault. But that's impossible. It's been sealed for decades. Someone unsealed it, Mrs. Kellerman. Someone with heavy equipment. She was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas's face. Finally, she stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. There might be something you need to see, she said, returning with a collection of documents and photographs. These are records from the cemetery board meetings in 1994. Thomas examined the papers, noting the familiar letterhead and official seals. Most of the documents dealt with routine maintenance issues, budget approvals, and landscaping decisions. But one item caught his attention. A proposal dated September 15, 1994, just 1 month before his father's disappearance. A proposal to relocate the Morrison Vault? Thomas looked up at Martha. Why would they want to do that? The cemetery was expanding, and the vault was in the way of the new section. The board voted to have it moved to the older part of the cemetery, where it is now. Martha pointed to a signature at the bottom of the document. The motion was made by Jake Morrison himself. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. Jake Morrison had proposed moving his own family's vault just 1 month before Patrick Brennan disappeared. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Mrs. Kellerman, who else would have known about this proposal? All the board members, certainly. And the groundskeeper would have been consulted about the logistics? She paused. Your father would have known about it. Did they actually move the vault? Martha flipped through more documents. According to these records, the project was delayed due to complications. It wasn't actually moved until November 1994, almost a month after your father disappeared. Thomas studied the timeline, his mind racing. Jake Morrison had proposed moving the vault in September. Patrick Brennan had started receiving mysterious phone calls around the same time. His father had made $3,000 in cash deposits during September, and then in October, Patrick had disappeared, only to be found 20 years later in the very vault Jake had wanted to move. Mrs. Kellerman, do you remember anything unusual about that time period? Any gossip or rumors about the cemetery project? The elderly woman's eyes grew distant. There were whispers about cost overruns, about someone taking kickbacks from the construction contracts. But you know how small towns are. There's always gossip about public projects. Do you remember who was suspected of taking kickbacks? I don't like to repeat rumors, Thomas, but... She hesitated, then continued. People said your father was living above his means. New car, expensive repairs to your house, medical bills paid in full when everyone knew he was struggling financially. Thomas felt sick. His father hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been taking bribes from someone connected to the cemetery project, and that someone had killed him to keep the secret. Mrs. Kellerman, I need to see the complete records from the cemetery board meetings in 1994. All of them. She nodded toward a larger filing cabinet. They're all there. But Thomas, be careful. Sometimes the truth is more dangerous than ignorance. As Thomas spent the next 2 hours reviewing documents, a clear picture began to emerge. The cemetery expansion project in 1994 had been worth over $50,000, a significant sum for a small town. The contracts had been awarded to Morrison Construction, Jake's father's company, and the project had been approved despite being the highest of 3 bids. More troubling, the records showed that Patrick Brennan had been the board member who had advocated most strongly for accepting Morrison's bid. His signature appeared on multiple documents recommending the company for the contract. Thomas found himself staring at his father's handwriting, the familiar loops and curves that had signed his report cards and birthday cards for years. But now those same pen strokes seemed to spell out corruption and betrayal. Find what you were looking for? Martha asked, appearing beside him with a cup of tea. More than I wanted to, Thomas replied. Mrs. Kellerman, what do you know about Jake Morrison's relationship with my father? They weren't friends, if that's what you're asking. Very different types of men. Your father was quiet, thoughtful, Jake was always more ambitious. She paused. But they worked together on the cemetery project. Had to, really, given their positions. Did you ever see them together socially? A few times, usually at town events or at the Roadhouse. She meant the local bar, the only place in Millbrook where men gathered to drink and talk about things they couldn't discuss at home. Actually, now that I think about it, I saw them together quite a bit in the weeks before your father disappeared. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. What were they doing? Talking, mostly. Always in hushed tones, always looking around to make sure no one was listening. Martha's expression grew troubled. I remember thinking it was odd, because they'd never been close before. Did you ever hear what they were talking about? Once. I was leaving the post office and they were standing by Jake's truck. I heard your father say something about the arrangement and that he wanted out. Martha shook her head. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it sounds like my father was involved in something he wanted to escape from. And perhaps someone didn't want to let him go. Thomas gathered up the documents he'd been studying, his mind reeling with new possibilities. His father hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been taking bribes from Jake Morrison in exchange for awarding inflated contracts to Morrison Construction. And when Patrick had tried to end the arrangement, Jake had killed him. But that raised a new question. If Jake had killed Patrick to protect their corruption scheme, why had he been so careful with the body? Why the respectful burial in the family vault? As Thomas left the Historical Society, he noticed that Jake Morrison's truck was parked across the street again. This time, Jake got out and walked toward him, his expression grim. We need to talk, Jake said. Thomas felt his heart pounding, but he kept his voice steady. About what? About your father. About what really happened 20 years ago. Jake glanced around nervously. Not here. Meet me at the old quarry tonight at 8 o'clock. The quarry was an abandoned limestone pit about 5 miles outside town, surrounded by dense woods and accessible only by a narrow dirt road. It was where teenagers went to drink beer and make out, where hunters cleaned their game, and where people went when they wanted to have conversations that couldn't be overheard. Why should I trust you? Thomas asked. Because I'm the only one who can tell you the truth about your father's death, Jake replied. And because if you don't hear it from me, you might never get the chance to hear it at all. With that cryptic warning, Jake walked back to his truck and drove away, leaving Thomas standing on the sidewalk with a growing sense that he was being drawn into something far more dangerous than he'd imagined. The old Millbrook quarry looked like a scar in the earth, its limestone walls glowing pale in the evening light. Thomas arrived 15 minutes early, parking his truck beside the rusted gate that had supposedly kept people out for the past decade. The chain holding the gate closed had been cut recently, probably by Jake. October evenings in Vermont carried a bite that went straight to the bone, and Thomas pulled his jacket closer as he made his way down the winding path to the quarry floor. The air smelled of decomposing leaves and standing water, with an underlying mineral scent from the limestone that had been blasted out of here 40 years ago. Jake Morrison was already there, sitting on a fallen log near the edge of the dark water that had filled the pit. He was smoking a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly in the cold air. You came, Jake said without looking up. You said you'd tell me the truth about my father. Jake took a long drag from his cigarette, then flicked it into the water. The truth is more complicated than you think, Tom. More complicated than what the sheriff thinks too. Thomas remained standing, maintaining distance between himself and his childhood friend. Why don't you start with the $3,000 my father deposited in September 1994? Jake's head snapped up. They told you about that. They told me about the affair too, and about the cemetery contracts. Thomas kept his voice steady, professional. What I want to know is which one of those things got him killed. Neither, Jake said quietly. And both. That's not an answer. Jake stood up, pacing to the edge of the water. Your father wasn't taking bribes, Tom. He was being blackmailed. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Blackmailed? By who? By me. Thomas felt the world tilt around him. You were blackmailing my father? Not for money, for cooperation. Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. My father's construction company was in serious financial trouble in 1994. We needed the cemetery contract to survive. But there were other bids that were lower, better. So you blackmailed my father to make sure you got the contract. I blackmailed him to make sure he recommended us despite the higher bid. Jake turned to face Thomas, his expression haunted. I knew about the affair, Tom. I knew about the woman he was seeing, and I knew her husband would kill them both if he found out. Thomas felt sick. Who was she? Helen Morrison, my wife. The revelation hit Thomas like a lightning bolt. His father had been having an affair with Jake's wife, and Jake had used that knowledge to force Patrick to award the cemetery contract to Morrison Construction. Jesus Christ, Thomas whispered. Your father was a good man caught in an impossible situation, Jake continued. He loved Helen and she loved him, but she was trapped in a marriage with a man who had already threatened to kill her once before. You threatened to kill your own wife? I was younger then, stupider, more violent. Jake's voice was filled with self-loathing. I thought I could control people with fear. I thought I could make Helen love me by threatening the man she actually loved. Thomas tried to process this information. The $3,000 was what I paid your father to recommend my company for the contract. I called it a consulting fee, but we both knew what it really was. Jake lit another cigarette with shaking hands. I was buying his cooperation with money while threatening to destroy his life if he didn't comply. But something went wrong. Everything went wrong. Jake's voice broke. Helen found out what I was doing. She was horrified that I was using her affair to extort money from the town. She threatened to leave me, to expose everything unless I stopped. And that's when you killed my father? No. Jake's voice was firm. I didn't kill your father, Tom. Helen did. Thomas stared at his childhood friend, trying to understand what he was hearing. Helen killed my father. They were supposed to meet that night to discuss running away together. Helen was finally ready to leave me, and Patrick was going to quit his job and go with her. Jake took a shuddering breath. But I followed her to the cemetery. I wanted to confront them, to try to talk her out of leaving. What happened? I found them arguing. Helen was crying, saying she couldn't go through with it. She was afraid of what I might do to her parents, to her sister, to anyone who helped her. Jake's voice grew distant. Patrick was trying to convince her that they could protect each other, that love was worth the risk. And you confronted them? I tried to, but when I stepped out of the shadows, Helen panicked. She thought I was going to kill them both. Jake's cigarette had burned down to his fingers again, but he didn't seem to notice. She grabbed a shovel from your father's truck and swung it at me, but Patrick stepped between us, trying to protect me from her. Thomas felt his legs weaken. She hit my father instead of you? The blow caught him in the side of the head. He went down hard, hit his head on a gravestone. Jake's voice was barely audible. He was unconscious, bleeding. Helen was screaming. I was trying to figure out what to do. Was he dead? No, not yet. Jake's voice broke completely. He was alive for maybe 10 minutes, conscious for some of it. He kept asking about Helen, whether she was okay. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face. What did you do? I tried to get him to a hospital, but Helen was hysterical. She said if we called for help, everyone would know about the affair. Her family would be destroyed. Your family would be destroyed. Jake's voice was filled with anguish. She begged me to help her hide what had happened. So you buried him in your family's vault? We didn't have a choice. He died while we were trying to decide what to do. Jake's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. Helen said we had to make it look like he'd disappeared, that it was the only way to protect both families. Thomas stared across the dark water of the quarry, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. His father had died in an accident, killed by the woman he loved while trying to protect the man who had been blackmailing him. Why the vault? Thomas asked. It was scheduled to be moved the next month. I knew no one would look inside it before then. Jake's voice was hollow. I thought maybe I could move the body later, give him a proper burial somewhere. But when the time came, I couldn't do it. I couldn't disturb him again. So you moved the entire vault instead. I moved it to the old section of the cemetery, where it would be left alone. I thought he'd be safe there. Jake looked at Thomas with desperate eyes. I know it sounds crazy, but I wanted to give him some kind of dignity, some kind of peace. Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions: grief, anger, confusion, and something that might have been sympathy. What happened to Helen? She left town 2 days later, said she was going to visit her sister in California and never came back. Jake's voice was filled with regret. I never saw her again. Got divorce papers in the mail about 6 months later. And you've carried this secret for 20 years? Every day, every single day. Jake's voice was barely a whisper. I loved her, Tom. I know I had a twisted way of showing it, but I genuinely loved her. And I respected your father, even though I hated him for taking her away from me. Thomas stared at the man who had been his friend, his neighbor, his father's killer, and his father's protector. The complexity of the situation was overwhelming. Jake, you realize you're confessing to accessory to murder, to blackmail, to corruption? I know. Jake's voice was steady now, resigned. I've known for 20 years that this day would come. I've been waiting for it. Why didn't you just tell the truth back then? Because I was a coward. Because I was afraid of going to prison, of losing everything. Jake looked at Thomas with haunted eyes. But mostly because I was afraid of destroying Helen's life any more than I already had. As Thomas stood in the gathering darkness beside the quarry, he realized that his father's death had been the result of a perfect storm of love, fear, greed, and desperation. Patrick Brennan had died not because he was evil, but because he was human, flawed, complicated, and ultimately tragic. What happens now? Jake asked. Thomas looked at his childhood friend, seeing not the monster he'd expected to find, but a broken man who had spent 20 years paying for one terrible night. Now you're going to come with me to the sheriff's office, Thomas said, and you're going to tell them everything you just told me. Jake nodded, dropping his cigarette and crushing it under his heel. I know. As they walked back toward their trucks, Thomas found himself thinking about forgiveness, about justice, and about the terrible weight of secrets. His father was finally going to get the burial he deserved, and the truth about his death would finally be told. But the cost of that truth was going to destroy more lives than it saved. The Millbrook Sheriff's Office was quiet at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, with only the desk sergeant and a single deputy on duty. Thomas and Jake sat in the parking lot for several minutes, neither speaking, both understanding that walking through those doors would change everything. You don't have to do this, Thomas said finally. Jake looked at him with tired eyes. Yes, I do. I should have done it 20 years ago. Sheriff Henderson arrived within 15 minutes of Thomas's phone call, followed by Detective Rodriguez and a court stenographer. The interview room felt smaller with all of them present, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on Jake's face as he began to tell his story. I need to start by saying that I loved my wife, Jake began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, and I know that what I'm about to tell you makes that sound impossible, but it's the truth. Over the next 3 hours, Jake Morrison confessed to 20 years of lies. He told them about the blackmail, about the cemetery contracts, about the affair between his wife and Patrick Brennan. He described that terrible night in October 1994 when love and fear and desperation had combined to create a tragedy that destroyed multiple lives. Detective Rodriguez took notes throughout the confession, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. Thomas sat quietly in the corner, watching his childhood friend dismantle his own life with methodical precision. Mr. Morrison, Detective Rodriguez said during a brief break, you understand that you're confessing to multiple felonies: blackmail, conspiracy, accessory to manslaughter, obstruction of justice, abuse of a corpse. Jake nodded. I understand. And you're doing this without an attorney present. I've lived with this secret for 20 years, Detective. I don't want to live with it anymore. Sheriff Henderson leaned forward. Jake, where is Helen now? I don't know. The last address I had for her was in Los Angeles, but that was 15 years ago. The divorce was handled through lawyers. I never spoke to her directly after she left town. Did she ever try to contact you? Once. About 10 years ago, she called to tell me she was getting remarried. She wanted to make sure I wouldn't cause any problems for her new husband. Jake's voice was hollow. I told her I wished her well and hung up. That was the last time we spoke. Thomas found himself thinking about Helen Morrison, the woman who had accidentally killed his father and then disappeared into a new life. Part of him wanted to hate her, but he found that he couldn't. She had been as much a victim of circumstances as anyone else. Mr. Morrison, the stenographer said, I need you to read through your statement and initial each page if it's accurate. Jake took his time reading through the confession, occasionally making small corrections or additions. Thomas watched him sign his name at the bottom of each page, effectively ending the life he'd built on lies. What happens now? Jake asked. Now you're under arrest, Sheriff Henderson said, standing up. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. As Henderson continued reading Jake his Miranda rights, Thomas felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for his friend. Jake Morrison was about to lose everything: his freedom, his reputation, his position in the community. But he was also about to lose the terrible burden he'd carried for 20 years. Thomas, Jake said as the handcuffs clicked into place, I know you probably hate me right now, but I want you to know that I genuinely cared about your father. What happened that night, it wasn't supposed to happen. Thomas looked at the man who had been his friend, his neighbor, his father's killer. "I don't hate you, Jake. I feel sorry for you." "That's worse than hatred." "Maybe. But it's honest." After Jake was taken to the county jail, Thomas found himself alone with Sheriff Henderson in the empty interview room. The silence stretched between them, filled with 20 years of questions that had finally been answered. "How do you feel?" Henderson asked. "Tired," Thomas said. "Relieved, angry, confused." He paused. "All of it at once. It's going to take time to process all of this. The affair, the blackmail, the accident, it's a lot to absorb." Thomas nodded, staring at the empty chair where Jake had sat. "Sheriff, what's going to happen to him?" "That depends on a lot of factors. He's cooperated fully, shown genuine remorse, but he's also confessed to serious crimes that occurred over a 20-year period." Henderson closed the file folder. "A good attorney might be able to negotiate something, but Jake's looking at significant prison time." "And Helen?" "We'll try to find her, but after 20 years it's going to be difficult. And even if we do locate her, proving her involvement in Patrick's death will be challenging." Henderson shook his head. "She may have gotten away with it." Thomas thought about that. The woman who had killed his father living somewhere under a new name, perhaps with a new family, while Jake Morrison spent the last 20 years drowning in guilt and regret. "It doesn't seem fair," Thomas said. "Life rarely is," Henderson replied. "But your father's going to get a proper burial, and the truth is finally going to come out. That's something." As Thomas drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, he found himself thinking about forgiveness and justice, about the weight of secrets and the cost of truth. His father had been a flawed man who had made terrible choices, but he had also been a man who had loved deeply and tried to protect the people he cared about. Jake Morrison was a man who had committed serious crimes, but he was also a man who had spent 20 years paying for one terrible night. And Helen Morrison, wherever she was a woman who had made a split-second decision that had haunted two families for decades. None of them were entirely innocent, and none of them were entirely guilty. They were all just human beings who had been caught in circumstances beyond their control, making choices that seemed right at the time, but turned out to be tragically wrong. Thomas pulled into his driveway and sat in his truck for several minutes, looking at the house where his father had lived his double life. Inside, his wife and children were sleeping peacefully, unaware that their family's 20-year mystery had finally been solved. Tomorrow he would have to tell them the truth about Patrick Brennan, about the affair, about the blackmail, about the accident that had taken his life. It would be painful, but it would also be honest. And after 20 years of lies, honesty was what his father's memory deserved. As Thomas walked toward his front door, he noticed that the stars were unusually bright in the Vermont sky, scattered across the darkness like scattered diamonds. His father had always loved looking at the stars, had taught Thomas the names of the constellations when he was a child. Patrick Brennan had been dead for 20 years, but his son was finally going to be able to say goodbye. Patrick Brennan's funeral was held on a crisp November morning, exactly 20 years and 3 weeks after his disappearance. The service took place at St. Mary's Catholic Church on Maple Street, the same church where Patrick had been baptized, confirmed and married nearly 30 years earlier. Thomas stood at the front of the church, looking out at the congregation that had gathered to finally say goodbye to his father. The church was packed. Friends, neighbors, former co-workers, and people Thomas hadn't seen in years had come to pay their respects to a man whose death had haunted their community for 2 decades. Sheriff Henderson sat in the 3rd row, still wearing his uniform despite being officially off duty. Detective Rodriguez was there as well, along with several members of the cemetery board and most of the town's volunteer fire department, of which Patrick had been a member. Conspicuously absent was Jake Morrison, who was being held at the county jail pending arraignment. His lawyer had requested bail, but given the nature of the charges and the flight risk, the judge had denied the request. Jake would spend the foreseeable future behind bars, waiting for his day in court. "We are gathered here today," Father McKenna began, "not just to mourn the death of Patrick Brennan, but to celebrate his life and to find some measure of peace in the truth that has finally been revealed." Thomas had struggled with what to say about his father. How do you eulogize a man who had been having an affair? How do you honor someone who had been involved in corruption, even if he had been blackmailed into it? In the end, Thomas had decided to focus on the father he had known, the man who had taught him to throw a baseball, who had helped him with his homework, who had worked long hours to provide for his family. Those memories were real, even if they were incomplete. "My father was not a perfect man," Thomas said when it was his turn to speak. "He made mistakes, had regrets, and carried burdens that he probably should have shared with the people who loved him. But he was also a man who loved deeply, who worked hard and who tried to do right by his family and his community." Thomas paused, looking out at the faces of people who had known his father in different ways. 20 years ago, when he disappeared, we were left with questions that seemed impossible to answer. We wondered if he had abandoned us, if he had been the victim of a crime, or if he had simply walked away from a life that had become too difficult to bear. Now we know the truth. My father died in an accident, trying to protect someone he cared about. He was killed by someone who loved him, and he was buried by someone who respected him. It's not the ending any of us would have chosen, but it's the ending we have. Thomas glanced toward the empty pew where the Morrison family used to sit. Jake's children had moved away years ago, and his ex-wife Helen remained missing. An entire family had been destroyed by the events of that October night in 1994. "I want to thank Sheriff Henderson and Detective Rodriguez for their dedication to finding the truth," Thomas continued. "I want to thank the people of Millbrook for never giving up hope that my father would be found. And I want to thank everyone who has supported my family during these difficult weeks. Most of all, I want to thank my father for the lessons he taught me. Even in death, he taught me that love is complicated, that people are flawed, and that the truth is usually more complex than we want it to be. He taught me that forgiveness is possible, even when it's difficult, and that family is about more than just blood." After the service, the congregation moved to Millbrook Cemetery for the burial. Patrick's casket was carried to a plot in the newer section, far from the Morrison vault, where his body had been hidden for 20 years. Thomas had chosen a simple granite headstone with his father's name, dates, and a brief inscription: "Loving father and husband, finally at rest." As the priest spoke the final prayers, Thomas found himself thinking about Jake Morrison, sitting in a jail cell less than 5 miles away. Part of him wanted to hate Jake for what he had done, but he found that he couldn't. Jake had been a victim of his own fears and insecurities, just as Patrick had been a victim of his own choices. "Thomas," Sheriff Henderson said after the burial, "I wanted you to know that we've located Helen Morrison." Thomas looked up in surprise. "Where is she?" "Phoenix, Arizona. She's been living there under her maiden name for the past 15 years, remarried, has 2 kids. Henderson's expression was grim. "She's agreed to return to Vermont to face charges, but her lawyer is negotiating a plea deal." "What kind of charges?" "Manslaughter, at minimum. Possibly voluntary manslaughter, depending on how the prosecutor views the circumstances." Henderson shrugged. "She'll probably serve some time, but nothing like what Jake is facing." Thomas nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Helen Morrison would finally face justice for killing his father, but she would also lose the life she'd built over the past 20 years. Her children would learn that their mother was a killer, just as Thomas had learned that his father was an adulterer. "Sheriff," Thomas said, "I'd like to visit Jake before the trial begins." Henderson raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "I think it's necessary. There are things we need to say to each other." "I can arrange it, but Thomas, be careful. Anger and grief can make people do things they regret." "I'm not angry anymore," Thomas said, surprising himself with the realization. "I'm just tired. Tired of carrying this around, tired of wondering, tired of being afraid of the truth." As the crowd dispersed, and Thomas made his way back to his truck, he found himself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. A routine construction project had uncovered a 20-year-old murder. A man's confession had revealed a web of blackmail and corruption, and a community's darkest secret had finally been exposed to the light. His father was finally at rest, buried in consecrated ground with the prayers of the community and the love of his family. It wasn't the ending Thomas had hoped for 20 years ago, but it was an ending nonetheless. And sometimes Thomas reflected as he drove home through the streets of Millbrook, an ending was enough. The Rutland County Jail was a modern concrete building 20 miles from Millbrook, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. Thomas had never been inside a prison before, and the experience of going through metal detectors and searches was more unsettling than he had expected. Jake Morrison looked older than his 52 years, his face drawn and pale from 2 weeks of incarceration. He wore an orange jumpsuit that made his skin look sallow, and his hands shook slightly as he picked up the phone on his side of the reinforced glass partition. "I didn't think you'd come," Jake said, his voice hollow through the phone line. I wasn't sure I would either, Thomas replied, but I needed to see you. They sat in silence for a moment. Two men who had once been friends, now separated by bulletproof glass and 20 years of lies. How was the funeral? Jake asked. Good. Peaceful. A lot of people came. Thomas paused. Your kids were there. Jake's face crumpled. How are they handling all this? As well as can be expected. They're hurt, confused, angry, but they're good kids, Jake. They'll survive this. I've destroyed their lives. No, you made mistakes that had consequences. There's a difference. Thomas leaned forward. Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. I haven't lied to you since that night at the quarry. Did you love Helen? Jake was quiet for a long moment. Yes, I loved her deeply, desperately. That was part of the problem. And did she love my father? Yes. She loved Patrick in a way she never loved me. Jake's voice was filled with pain. I knew it too. I could see it in her eyes whenever she looked at him. Thomas tried to imagine the dynamics of that terrible triangle. His father torn between duty and desire, Helen trapped between fear and love, Jake consumed by jealousy and desperation. Why didn't you just let her go? Because I thought I could win her back. I thought if I could just control the situation, make the right moves, she'd realize that I was the one who truly loved her. Jake laughed bitterly. I was so stupid. You can't force someone to love you. No, you can't. Thomas, I want you to know that I never intended for any of this to happen. The blackmail, the corruption, your father's death, it all spiraled out of control so fast. I know. Do you forgive me? The question hung in the air between them. Thomas had been dreading it, knowing that Jake would ask, wondering what his answer would be. I'm working on it, Thomas said finally. I understand why you did what you did, even if I don't agree with it. And I know you've been paying for it every day for 20 years. That's not forgiveness. No, it's not, but it's a start. Jake nodded, accepting the partial absolution. What's going to happen to Helen? She's coming back to face charges. Sheriff Henderson says she'll probably serve some time, but not as much as you're looking at. Good. I mean, not good that she's being charged, but good that she's coming back. She needs to face this too. Thomas studied his friend's face, seeing genuine concern for the woman who had killed his father. Even now, after everything that had happened, Jake still cared about Helen Morrison. Jake, what really happened that night? I mean, the exact sequence of events. Jake closed his eyes, and Thomas could see him reliving that terrible October evening. Helen and Patrick were supposed to meet at the cemetery around 11 o'clock. She was going to tell him she was ready to leave with him. I followed her there, planning to confront them. What were you going to say? I don't know. I was going to beg her to stay, maybe threaten to expose the affair if she left. I was desperate. Jake opened his eyes. When I got there, they were arguing. Helen was crying, saying she couldn't go through with it. She was afraid of what I might do to her family. My father was trying to convince her to leave? Yes, he was telling her that they could protect each other, that love was worth the risk. He was being gentle with her, patient. Jake's voice grew thick with emotion. He was a better man than I was. What happened when you stepped out of the shadows? Helen screamed. She thought I was going to attack them, maybe kill them both. She grabbed the first thing she could find, a shovel from Patrick's truck, and swung it at me. But my father stepped between you. He was trying to protect me, Thomas. Even after everything I'd done to him, he was trying to protect me from her. Jake's voice broke. The shovel caught him in the temple. He went down hard, hit his head on the corner of a gravestone. Thomas felt tears in his eyes. His father had died trying to protect the man who had been blackmailing him. How long was he conscious? Maybe 10 minutes. He kept asking about Helen, whether she was hurt. He was more concerned about her than about himself. Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I tried to stop the bleeding, but there was too much damage. He died holding Helen's hand. And then you decided to hide the body? Helen was hysterical. She kept saying that if anyone found out what happened, both families would be destroyed. She begged me to help her make it look like Patrick had just disappeared. So you put him in the Morrison vault. It was the only place I could think of. I knew it was scheduled to be moved, and I thought maybe I could figure out what to do with the body later. Jake shook his head. But when the time came, I couldn't do it. I couldn't disturb him again. So you moved the entire vault instead. I wanted to give him some dignity, some peace. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt like I owed him that much. Thomas thought about the careful way his father's body had been arranged, the respect that had been shown even in death. It was a small comfort. but it was something. "Jake, what's going to happen to you?" "My lawyer thinks I'm looking at 10 to 15 years, maybe less if I continue to cooperate." Jake shrugged. "I deserve whatever I get." "What about your kids? They're adults now. They have their own lives. Maybe this will be easier for them if I'm not around to remind them of what their father did." Thomas shook his head. "Don't do that. Don't use martyrdom as an excuse to give up on your family." "What do you mean?" "I mean that your kids are going to need you more than ever now. They're going to need to understand that their father made mistakes, but isn't a monster. They're going to need to see that you're taking responsibility for your actions." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "You're right. I need to be strong for them, even if it's from prison." "Yes, you do." The guard signaled that visiting hours were ending. Jake and Thomas hung up their phones and looked at each other through the glass partition. "Thomas," Jake said, his voice muffled by the barrier between them, "thank you for coming. Thank you for telling the truth." As Thomas left the jail and drove back toward Millbrook, he found himself thinking about the complexity of human nature. Jake Morrison had committed serious crimes, but he had also shown genuine remorse and had spent 20 years paying for his mistakes. Helen Morrison had killed his father, but she had also been a victim of circumstances beyond her control. And his father, Patrick Brennan, had been an adulterer and a participant in corruption, but he had also been a man who had tried to protect the people he loved, even the man who had been blackmailing him. None of them were entirely good or entirely evil. They were all just human beings who had made choices that seemed right at the time but turned out to be tragically wrong. Thomas was beginning to understand that forgiveness wasn't about excusing someone's actions. It was about accepting their humanity, acknowledging their capacity for both good and evil, and choosing to move forward without carrying the poison of hatred. He wasn't there yet, but he was getting closer. Helen Morrison arrived in Millbrook on a grey December morning, accompanied by her attorney and a sense of inevitability that had been building for 20 years. Thomas first saw her at the courthouse, where she was being arraigned on charges of involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice. She looked older than her 51 years, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, her face marked by 2 decades of carrying a terrible secret, but her eyes were the same, green and intelligent, with a depth that spoke of pain and regret. Thomas found himself studying her as she sat beside her lawyer, trying to reconcile this woman with the image he'd carried in his mind for 20 years. She had been the other woman, the reason his father had been willing to abandon his family, but she was also the woman who had accidentally killed the man she loved, and who had lived with that knowledge for 2 decades. "Mrs. Morrison," Judge Patricia Kellerman said, "you understand the charges against you." "Yes, Your Honor." Helen's voice was steady, but Thomas could see her hands trembling. "How do you plead?" "Guilty to involuntary manslaughter, Your Honor, not guilty to obstruction of justice." Thomas felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sympathy. Helen was taking responsibility for killing his father, but she was fighting the charge that she had deliberately hidden the crime. After the arraignment, Thomas found himself face to face with Helen in the courthouse hallway. She looked at him with recognition and pain. "You're Thomas," she said quietly. "Yes. You look like your father." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "Did you love him?" Helen's composure cracked for a moment. "Yes, I loved him very much. Enough to destroy 2 families. That was never our intention. We thought we could find a way to be together without hurting anyone." Helen's voice was barely above a whisper. "We were naive. You were selfish." "Yes, we were that too." Thomas studied her face, seeing the weight of 20 years of regret. "Why did you come back?" "Because I was tired of running. Because I have children now and I don't want them to learn about their mother's past from a news report." Helen looked at him with desperate honesty. "And because I owed it to your father to face the consequences of what I did." "You killed him." "I killed him trying to protect him from a man I thought was going to murder us both." Helen's voice was firm. "It was an accident, Thomas. A terrible, tragic accident. An accident that you covered up for 20 years. "Yes, and I've paid for that decision every day since." Thomas wanted to hate her, but he found that he couldn't. Helen Morrison was a broken woman who had made a terrible choice and had been paying for it ever since. "Mrs. Morrison," Helen's attorney said, approaching them, "we need to discuss your testimony." As Helen was led away, Thomas found himself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought them all to this moment. His father had loved this woman enough to risk everything for her. She had killed him trying to protect him from her husband, and Jake Morrison had spent 20 years carrying the guilt of them all. 3 weeks later, Helen Morrison was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 3 years. The judge noted her cooperation with authorities and her 20 years of otherwise exemplary behavior as factors in the lenient sentence. Jake Morrison pled guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. His attorney had argued for a lesser sentence based on his cooperation and remorse, but the judge was less sympathetic to a man who had spent 20 years in positions of trust while hiding his crimes. Thomas attended both sentencing hearings, watching as the legal system tried to balance justice with mercy. Both defendants had shown genuine remorse, both had cooperated fully with authorities, and both had already paid a significant price for their crimes. But the law demanded more than regret and cooperation. It demanded punishment, consequences, and a recognition that some actions have prices that must be paid regardless of the circumstances that led to them. As Thomas left the courthouse after Jake's sentencing, he found himself thinking about closure. His father's killer had been brought to justice, the truth about Patrick Brennan's death had been revealed, and the mystery that had haunted Millbrook for 20 years had finally been solved. But closure, Thomas realized, wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you chose to create. He could spend the rest of his life angry about his father's affair, bitter about the corruption and blackmail, resentful about the 20 years of lies and uncertainty. Or he could choose to focus on the love his father had shown his family, the respect he had earned in his community, and the lessons his life and death had taught about the complexity of human nature. Thomas walked out of the courthouse into the December afternoon, where snow was beginning to fall on the streets of Millbrook. It was almost Christmas, a time for family and forgiveness, for reflection and renewal. His father was finally at rest, buried in consecrated ground with the prayers of the community and the love of his family. The truth about Patrick Brennan's death was known, and justice had been served as well as it could be after 20 years. It wasn't the ending Thomas had hoped for when he was 32 years old, and his father had simply vanished into the night. But it was an ending nonetheless, and sometimes an ending was enough. Thomas got into his truck and drove home through the falling snow, ready to tell his family that it was time to stop living in the shadow of the past and start building a future based on truth, forgiveness, and the complicated but enduring power of love. Spring came early to Millbrook in 2015, with the snow melting by mid-March and the first daffodils blooming in the cemetery by the end of the month. Thomas had been making regular visits to his father's grave, sometimes alone, sometimes with his wife and children, always with a sense of peace that had been absent for 20 years. The headstone he had chosen was simple granite, weathered now by a Vermont winter and marked by the passage of time. Patrick Brennan, loving father and husband, finally at rest. The words seemed more true now than they had 6 months ago. Thomas knelt beside the grave, placing fresh flowers in the small vase he had installed. Daffodils, his father's favorite, because they were the first sign that winter was ending and spring was beginning. Patrick had always said that daffodils were proof that life was stronger than death, that hope was stronger than despair. "I brought you something," Thomas said quietly, pulling a small object from his pocket. It was his father's watch, the 1970 Timex that had been the key to solving the mystery of Patrick's disappearance. The sheriff had released it as evidence after the trials were completed, and Thomas had had it cleaned and repaired. The watch was running again, its hands moving steadily through the hours and minutes and seconds that made up a life. Thomas had considered wearing it himself, but he had decided instead to bury it with his father, where it belonged. "I thought you might want this back," Thomas said, placing the watch at the base of the headstone. "I know it meant a lot to you." A gentle breeze stirred the daffodils, and Thomas found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a man haunted by unanswered questions about his father's disappearance. Now he was a man who had found peace with difficult truths about his father's life and death. "Thomas?" He turned to see Sheriff Henderson approaching, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes and his official bearing replaced by the manner of a friend. "Sheriff, I didn't expect to see you here. I come by sometimes. Your father was a good man despite everything." Henderson looked down at the grave. "I wanted to let you know that Helen Morrison was released last week. Good behavior, model prisoner." Thomas nodded. He had known that Helen's release was approaching, and he had been preparing himself for the possibility of seeing her again. "How do you feel about that?" Henderson asked. I'm glad she's free. She's paid for what she did, and she has children who need her. Thomas stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. I hope she can find some peace now. That's very generous of you. It's not generous, it's necessary. I can't carry anger and hatred for the rest of my life. It would poison everything I touch. Henderson was quiet for a moment. What about Jake Morrison? He's got about 8 years left on his sentence. I write to him sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. He's doing well, from what I hear. Teaching literacy classes to other inmates, helping with the prison library. Thomas smiled slightly. He's still trying to fix things, even from prison. Will you visit him again? Maybe. When I'm ready. When he's ready. Thomas looked at his father's grave. We both have more healing to do. As they walked back toward the cemetery parking lot, Thomas found himself thinking about the nature of forgiveness. It wasn't a single act, he had learned, but a process that unfolded over time. It required understanding, acceptance, and a willingness to let go of the need for perfect justice. Thomas, Henderson said as they reached their cars, I want you to know that solving your father's case was one of the most important things I've done as sheriff, not just because it brought closure to you and your family, but because it reminded me why I became a cop in the first place. To find the truth? To help people find peace with the truth, even when it's not the truth they wanted to hear. Thomas shook hands with the sheriff, then got into his truck and drove home through the streets of Millbrook. The town looked the same as it had before his father's body was discovered, but Thomas knew that it was different now. The secret that had haunted the community for 20 years was gone, replaced by a truth that was difficult, but ultimately healing. At home, Thomas found his family gathered around the kitchen table, his wife Susan helping their daughter Emma with her homework, while their son Michael practiced guitar in the living room. It was the kind of normal family scene that Patrick Brennan had valued above all else, the kind of life he had been willing to sacrifice for love. How was your visit to the cemetery? Susan asked, looking up from Emma's math problems. Good. Peaceful. I think Dad would be happy to know that spring is coming. Susan smiled, understanding the significance of the observation. They had all learned to find meaning in small things, to appreciate the simple rhythms of life that continued, despite tragedy and loss. I made your favorite dinner, Susan said. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, just like your mother used to make. Just like Grandma Mary used to make, Emma added, not looking up from her homework. Thomas felt a wave of gratitude for his family, for their patience and understanding during the difficult months since his father's body was discovered. They had supported him through the investigation, the trials, and the long process of coming to terms with the truth about Patrick Brennan's life and death. Dad, Michael called from the living room, can you help me with this chord progression? I'm trying to learn that song Grandpa used to sing. Thomas smiled, remembering his father's love of music and his habit of singing while he worked in the cemetery. Patrick had known dozens of old songs, folk tunes and hymns and ballads that told stories of love and loss and redemption. Which song? Thomas asked, joining his son in the living room. Amazing Grace. I know it's kind of old-fashioned, but I thought it would be nice to play at the memorial service next month. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. The memorial service was being planned for the first anniversary of Patrick's discovery, a chance for the community to remember him and to find closure with the events of the past year. I think that's a perfect choice, Thomas said, sitting beside his son. Grandpa would love to hear you play it. As Michael played the opening chords of the hymn, Thomas found himself thinking about grace, about forgiveness and redemption, about the possibility of finding peace even in the midst of tragedy. His father had been a flawed man who had made terrible choices, but he had also been a man who had loved deeply and had died trying to protect others. Jake Morrison had committed serious crimes, but he had also spent 20 years paying for his mistakes and was now trying to make amends from prison. Helen Morrison had killed the man she loved, but she had also been a victim of circumstances beyond her control and had spent 2 decades carrying the guilt of her actions. None of them were entirely good or entirely evil. They were all just human beings who had been caught in circumstances beyond their control, making choices that seemed right at the time, but turned out to be tragically wrong. And Thomas himself was a man who had spent 20 years wondering about his father's fate, who had discovered truths that were more complex than he had imagined, and who had chosen to find peace with those truths rather than remain trapped by anger and resentment. As his son played Amazing Grace, and his family prepared for another evening of ordinary life, Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had been painful and difficult, but it had also been necessary. His father was finally at rest. The truth about Patrick Brennan's death was known, and the mystery that had haunted Millbrook for 20 years had been solved. But more than that, Thomas had learned something valuable about the nature of forgiveness, about the complexity of human nature, and about the possibility of finding peace even in the midst of tragedy. The watch he had left at his father's grave would keep perfect time, marking the passage of hours and days and years in the quiet peace of the cemetery. And Thomas would continue to visit, to remember, and to find meaning in the simple truth that love, however flawed and complicated, was stronger than death. Outside, the first warm breeze of spring stirred the daffodils that would soon bloom throughout Millbrook, bringing with them the promise of renewal and hope. Winter was ending, and spring was beginning, and life, in all its complexity and beauty, was going on. Patrick Brennan was finally at rest, and his son had finally found peace.